So thank you for joining us today for Domestic Departures. This is what we call our research convening, which happens every 2 years as a way of marking, I suppose, not necessarily completion, but some sort of way of sharing the work that happens through our research grants program. I think this year's convening is really bringing together people whose work helps us think about what we're experiencing in the present. Do any of us feel that we really have a right to our land, that we can feel safe, that it will last forever, be there for our future generations? In a time of siege, all we can offer is a multiplicity of perspectives and positions that are, in fact, rooted in precarity. We can learn from those who walk the earth, those who have lost their homes, and those who have never felt at home. Over the last 2 years, our team, Shama Nair in particular, and our research grantees, who you will all hear from today, have formed a sort of virtual community of thinkers who have collaborated extensively to bring together this convening. They've elected to disseminate their work through displays, workshops, and both experimental and performative presentations. They encourage you, as you will experience today, and through their projects, to get closer to and to learn from the ground itself. Thank you for joining us, and I will let Shama tell you more about each of their projects. So the way... Sorry. And we'll introduce each project before they present their work, just so that it stays present with you.
Yeah. Okay. Hi, everyone. If I could invite everyone to, again, gather closer. Feel free to sit where we're sitting. If you could just take your shoes off. But this is... Oh. I see you, Nikhil. But yeah. Because, I mean, as part of the presentation, Natasha and Rhea have some material that would help us better understand the project and what they've been thinking about and how they've been thinking about it. So if you come closer, you'll just get a better view. But to briefly introduce Natasha and Rhea's project, titled, Can We Become Nomadic? Their research essentially seeks to explore the interconnectedness between human-animal environments by focusing on the experiences of mobile pastoralists in Western India. The research proposes to highlight the relational, temporal, and affective dynamics of pastoral mobility and the agency that pastoral practices accord to non-human companions and environments. And they do this, or they share this with us through experimental cartography methods and visual documentation, as you can see in front of you today. By doing so, they want to shift the ground of representation from the colonial and capitalistic privileging of the geospatial to the temporal, to the temporal and material, sorry, as it is lived and felt and embodied. Natasha Maru is a multidisciplinary social scientist and policy consultant with experience working with smallholder farms and pastoralists in India. She seeks to explore a politically aware arts-based medium for relating and expressing. Rhea Shah is a transdisciplinary designer who intervenes along all scales of the ecological realm through multi-species congruent art, objects, furniture, architecture, landscape, and urban infrastructure. She believes design emerges from kinship, reciprocity, and a becoming with the landscape. Natasha and Rhea will be in conversation with Rupali Gupte, who's an architect, urbanist, and an artist based in Mumbai, also a member of our selection committee for the research grants and residency. So again, more of our worlds are colliding. But thank you all once again for being with us, and over to you, Natasha and Rhea.
Hello. Is this working? Oh, yeah. Now it's on. Is yours working, Natasha?
Hello.
Yeah.
It seems like it is.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for being here and for being a part of this. Thanks for this wonderful introduction, Shama. We're going to just sort of run you through our research, but also tell you a little bit about how we got here and hopefully what we plan to do after this. So I was working on a research project called the Inhabited Sea, and I was chasing flamingos across Kutch, and reached this sort of, wanted to go to where they actually have their breeding grounds in the Run of Kutch, which is a large salt pan in Gujarat in Western India. And I took this taxi, which dropped me off to the road, and I walked in towards the wetland about a couple of kilometers in. And after doing all of the photoing and trying to look for footprints and nests and other things there, I realized that I've gotten really turned around, don't know the way out, and my phone has no network. And a few minutes of walking a bit frantically around, I found a rabari. A rabari is a rabari man with his camels. The rabari are a community of herders, nomadic herders. They're pastoralists. They keep sheep, camel, goats, and this particular man I encountered had camels. And I asked him how to get my way back to the road. He very sweetly just said, "There's no way you're going to find it," and then turned to a camel, patted the camel on the back and said, "Just follow this guy, he'll take you out." And then promptly turned around and went off in another direction. And sure enough, I followed this camel who very gently kept pace with me and was very slow so I could keep up. And he walked me out to the road and turned around and went back. And this was such a incredible moment for me, because all of this time I'd been thinking about human and other than human relations and how to read the environment and how does one map it and think about it, and how does one know it. And here there was this beautiful instance of a camel that had guided me out of this landscape, but also this communication that seemed so easy but so sort of clear between the keeper and the camel, and so much trust in the agency of that camel to both find the way but also to come back. And I was very, very intrigued and wanted to read more and learn more about the rabari. And in the process of course, doing that research, I came across Natasha's work, and she'll tell you some about it.
So, once and please excuse my voice, it's a little bit hoarse and really strange today, but, we'll work with it, we'll do our best. But, the enduring story that Rhea said is, so commonplace in the context of pastoralism, in the context of Kutch, that I arrived there for the first time in 2015 to research with pastoralists, and almost, never left. And so, at the time that Rhea and I got in touch, I was still in Kutch doing research this time for my PhD. And I realized through this time that there were certain sort of ways of understanding pastoralism, and especially through the lens of mobility, that was really missing. So pastoralists in more sort of common mainstream discourses are often thought of as backward, as wild, as even environmentally damaging, and as, peoples who should be settled. But even though development discourse or, scholarship has in some senses moved away and showed actually the falseness of these notions, shown that, pastoralists actually have very intimate and embedded relationships with their environment, with their animals, and that mobility is very much central to this form of relating. Still the sort of ways in which mobility was being thought of was still through settled ways of thinking, was still through, very abstracted and, unqualified straight lines across a map that didn't really do justice to the relational, the affective, the sensorial, the really just friendship and allyship that pastoralists show to their environment and to, their more than human companions. And I think when I spoke with Rhea and, the ways in which she thought of these relationships really resonated with the ways that I was trying to approach what I was seeing in the field. I think that's when I was like, okay, we should really do something together when a chance arises. Um,
So getting back to that, yeah, sorry. Yeah, just and the first conversation Natasha and I had was in the little garden outside of my building, and we spoke about cartography and how much I had been trying to explore the alternate sort of ways of mapping both landscape and relationships and patterns and changes and the rhythms and pulses and flows of environment across landscape. As through my training as an architect and a landscape architect, I always felt like the base ground you worked with, the site or the map, was really where design began. And based on what you had as that ground, you developed a design, or all of your work then took form from that base. And so for a while, I had been thinking about the sort of hegemony of cartography and of the kind of cartography we know, rather, which is such a language born of the colonial idea to map the unknown, make it the terra nullius, and then find ways to property it, divide it, own it, tax it, and such. And I felt that it always missed those experiences of movement and ecology that I'd seen, particularly even in the landscapes that we eventually decided to work with. We see the effects of this cartography, the long history of that cartography becoming translated into areas of conservation that are, have a forester somewhere marking out mangroves abstractly from a satellite image or a map, with no sense of what makes that landscape, who has treaded that landscape, and who sort of like manages and maintains and repairs and sort of becomes with that landscape. And in the spaces that we work in, and you'll see some of that if you take a look at the photos around, the landscape is incredibly industrialized. It has, large refineries in parts, areas that used to be the commons where most of the herders would take their camels, have all been propertied and mostly privatized or industrialized. You have mines, you have salt pans that work with extracting bromide. You have oil refineries at huge scales, and what is left is then considered sacred nature, sort of defined under the forest rights, defined as a forest, and again, the camels and people are removed from it with the act of conservation. And so that sort of very complicated and layered landscape is where we started to go and meet.
So, this very huge Indian wedding that happened this year, right? Like the many $1 million Indian wedding. That's literally where we've worked. So where in India was this massive pre-wedding celebration with like all of the world's biggest people flying in, literally in the village next to that space is where we worked. So this is where the world's largest industry is. This is where all of India's oil refineries are. And in this sort of contested landscape, you see this very interesting and curious juxtaposition of the urban with the rural, of, conventional ideas of modernity, of progress, of, shifting urbanization and placemaking, juxtaposed with people who really seamlessly actually create their own sort of visions of being, placemaking, and home, imbibing things that they feel are useful for them, rejecting things that don't affect them, and still finding themselves in constant contestation with fast-changing contexts, essentially.
Also, just I'm just going to pass some around, but feel free to pick up some
Yeah.
of these so you get a better sense of the kind of landscapes we're looking at and thinking about.
And you can go for little walks with us through these
Yeah.
walking ones.
Okay.
Yeah.
In particular, we were also, and I think we've mentioned this before, but really interested in mobility and temporalities and the way that mobility would transform the way we think about land, about reciprocity, about stewardship. And we, circle back to this at some point, but that was really the guiding force for us to start thinking about how do you deconstruct, how do you work with the languages of cartography to think about ways that maps can then be temporal, can talk about movement, can allow you to experience and feel, and rather than sort of have you hovering over with a godlike view of this landscape as surveyor. We also wanted to think about then the paradigm of landscape that comes from mobility and impermanence, and that's sort of where we started this exploration of maps.
So as we begin to show you our maps, here's just a small note. The map maker ought to know. Are you okay?
I think it's all fine.
All right. The map maker ought to know that on this earth, everything moves, even our common beliefs. What seems obvious at first, an address, a roof, enclosure, and division, is not so. That folds are textured and prickly, edges shifting and ragged, greens turn yellow and blues turn brown, motion is duration. That places are made not by pen to paper, but by heart to heart, feet to terrain, milk to rain. That to survey, he has a part to play, and to make an intelligible mark, he has to stray and learn how to walk the coast, how to milk a camel, and how to cook in the dark.
Okay. So these were the sort of three questions that we want to explore and show you what we explored of these three questions today. And they kind of guided our three maps, which are, again, just explorations of the forms of maps and the way that you then read and experience them. I'm going to start with the first, which is how to walk the coast. I'm just going to show you guys here because it seems the best way to do it, but then we'll pass it around so those of you at the back that can't see it can take a look. With how to walk the coast, it started with kind of asking the question of, like, can we stop looking from above and start looking from within? And how can a map and the form of a map allow you to sort of start to do that? In the process, I ended up marking one of the first coasts that we walked with Ramabhai, which was the coast along the Brahmaji temple in near Porbandar. And I just started to sort of like draw those sections and construct a book that with those sections so that you could start to then like see the map unfold as you go through the sections and kind of look at the details of it. The sections in the center are sort of like a bigger scale, like a finer scale, so you then start to see the scale of the landscape around you, while the top is a much longer 10-kilometer stretch. And just through the experience of making, I realized that you want to also see and feel like you're within it, which means that you have birds, animals, creatures coming closer and further. And so started to try and put those in. And again, so some of the kind of creatures you see here, or like the other beings you see here, are anywhere from invasive species that camels feed off of. And the whole hope was to kind of look at the small sort of undulations of the coast and what that might mean for biodiversity and what that means for thriving of camels in this space. in order to because, again, educated the way I am, I have to think about the plan as well. So in order to sort of start to construct the plan, I ended up kind of thinking about dipping each of these in blue ink and then dipping it again in the sea and letting a wave kind of rush through them and leaving the waves marks as a part of the plan. So that's sort of the final scale where it's really the scale of the sea with the body. And yeah, I'm just going to pass it around for anyone wants to take a look.
The second question that we were trying to think through was how to milk a camel. And how to milk a camel really, I mean, when, I would think of responding to that question, it's really about how to milk a camel is to know a camel. If you know a camel, you can milk a camel. And so we began with making this. This map essentially brings you closer to a camel body. And in its form, essentially, it has all of these twists and turns that allow you to discover in multiple ways, in ways that you would like, different parts of camels. You can flip it open, you can open it this way, you can do what you want with it and discover different parts of a camel. The background wash is something, we worked and thought through these kinds of things with the pastoralists. And we asked them, what colors are the seasons? And each of the seasons had different colors. And it was very curious because the monsoon was the sky, and the winter was really the colors of the crops. The summer was very much color of the earth, the ochres and the browns. And these kind of colors reflect on the paper, and kind of through these translucent images, inscribe season and terrain onto the camels itself as well. But I think the most fun part about making this book was really what's gone on top. And if you come closer and really touch it and feel it, you'll have a good sense of it. But it's really, we've taken camel prints of camels' bodies, inked camels' bodies, and pressed the sheets against camel bodies. And so you get these impressions of, the camel hair, there's hair stuck to it, there's, all of this mud of the skin of the back of a camel's back stuck to it, there's camel milk spilled on it. And really, it's also been rolled in dung and the earth and all of that. So if you really even come to touch it, you feel it. If you come close to it, you smell it. So you very intimately come to know the different sort of contours of a camel's body that are reflected through all of these lines. And on the other side, which is any side really, you see very closely the sort of intimate relations the herders build with the camels, and the moments of touch between the pastoralist and the camel. So much of the camel is known by the pastoralist. Like, each of the camels have personality, they have a name, they have their own characteristics. Even the senses that the pastoralists have, right? Like the harness, we have a harness here for the camel. And that this part is called a vano, which is what goes on the udders of a camel. But all of these are handmade by the pastoralists. And so this relationship between the pastoralists and the animal is also something that gives them joy, that builds crafts, that builds aesthetics, that builds a sense of art, that builds even things like measurements. These are the different measures that Jagabhai was teaching me. And these are in common vocabulary and come, with these senses of making these vanos. No, open it? Oh, yeah. And when you open the books up, which is also a process, but when you open the books up, you have the chance also to discover certain things in composition, and you'll see more clearly how the camels' bodies are reflected in these contours and the relationships are.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes,
Yeah,
please feel free.
please do.
All of these quilts are to sit on.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. And so the third map
can
that
pass
we
these
worked
on.
on, and actually is,
Sit on.
it's nice that we're ending with it, but it's probably the one that we started talking about first when we started thinking about the forms of how these maps will work, was how to cook in the dark. And how to cook in the dark, like with all the other maps, we thought about how we encounter scale in maps and how to sort of juxtaposition multiple kinds of scales within the map. So as you open the book, the first thing you find is a map of the sky, which, as with most seamen or people of the desert, they navigate by stars. And so the sort of cosmos above. And as you go in, you start with the scale of the hands of, and for many of you that joined our workshop yesterday know what rotla making feels like now, but the very intimate act of making rotla at the scale of the hand. As you sort of open up the book and the map, and it takes sort of time to do this, the first scale you see is the scale of the camp. And this is, G.V. Baden cooking, but also the sort of the katlas on the end, some of which you see here, the beginning of the fields or the beginning of the spaces where the camels rest. The next scale again shifts you back to the scale of making rotlas, of making, cooking with your hands in the dark through feel and sense and touch. And the last sort of scale that you open up to is really the landscape around. And so whether it's the bajra and cotton fields, the residues of which the camels often browse on, but also become an integral part of how women navigate the landscape, because they're often trading their services of harvesting in order to have the right to stay there. But also the neem trees and chiku trees and the few orchards around that the camels browse the leaves of. But also the intense industrialization, the oil refineries, the lights of which light the night sky consistently. And the sort of, on that end, the mangroves and the walks of, the forests that are now increasingly being sort of demarcated and removed from the commons as protected, conserved landscapes. Do you want to? Yeah, okay. And there's a few copies of these around. I know it takes space to open, but that also brings me back to the question of why we chose this way of putting things together. The primary act of space making that we felt on the field or like on camp was the hearth. The hearth is the center of the home, and when there aren't any walls, it's the quilts that make the floor, and sort of everyone turning inwards that defines where the home begins and where the camp ends. And so in sort of like, to go with that sense of horizontality, we wanted to encourage everyone to be on the ground and explore on the ground as you open the maps and sort of look through them.
Yeah. Pastoral camps have no walls. They don't bar anyone from coming closer and coming in. And so, yeah, the quilts, especially, I think for us, were a way of paying homage to all of the women that have hosted us through our research process, who've welcomed us into their hearts, their homes. And also, if you see, on these quilts are also motifs that speak very much to pastoral lives. So, for example, the little blue thing there, that's a tea kettle, which, is very important when you're pastoralist and drinking 10 cups of tea a day. But also these birds. There are parrots, peacocks that are really popular in like farm areas close to where they are. Peacocks symbolize rain, parrots symbolize fruit. The birds, there are some birds there. They're called the coonj. I don't know what a coonj is in English. but a kunj is a coastal bird, and you find it very popularly actually close to camp in coastal areas. But then there's also the pastoralist there with his milk jugs, which is called a kawad in Gujarati, and the women with their water jugs, who are called paniyaris. And so these kind of symbolizing and bringing us back to pastoral lives and homes.
Yeah, and in the nature of making camp and making hearth, we wanted to keep that space that we always shared, the space of conversation, a space of actually a lot of jest and a lot of humor as well, a lot of pulling of legs in and around the hearth and the campfire. And so would love to open this up to ideas, questions, thoughts, just conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rhea and Natasha. This is actually a continuation of a journey we had yesterday with the two of you, where we all cooked in the dark. And so I'll come back to that a little bit. But I just wanted to start with this idea that, you took us through this landscape. But I also want you to speak about this idea of new nature, because in some ways, you spoke about this idea that there are the pastoralists, but there's also, it's not an essentialist landscape. There's the refineries, there's also the big fat Indian wedding that happened in the same place. So you speak about contestation and, the idea that it's not this kind of pristine idea of nature, but there is this new nature that is happening, right? So how do the pastoralists then negotiate this nature? Is there a different way of sensing this new landscape? And what are some of the pushbacks to that?
Sure. So thanks for that, Rupali. It's really one of those things that we thought about, and I'm going to start with another story that sort of like really stayed with me. One of our first walks along the coast was with Ramabhai and his son, and we walked, into the mangroves along that Brahmaji temple and went into, once the camels were sort of in the mangroves foraging on their own, he said, let's find some shade and cook some, have some tea. And we were sort of walking around trying to find a shadier spot, which was a little bit dry. And we arrive at this spot that's covered in plastic. And, plastic that's basically been washed out from the sea. It's just, the worst kind of like heaps and heaps of plastic in every corner. And he very comfortably finds a spot and sits in it. And, both of us were just so uncomfortable. And he obviously sensed this. And he turns to us and he says, but that's clean, that's been washed by the sea. And it kind of brings us to that question that, again, this is by no means a pristine nature, but has there ever been one? Has there ever been a nature that's pristine? In that same walk, one of the things he was pointing out is how you could see the footprints of the camels from the previous walks and how they were creating the perfect dens to allow mangroves to grow. But you find these sort of consistent sort of relationships between things that, we think of as natural, not natural, agricultural, plastic, industrial, all of those consistently on site. And I feel also that one of the big learnings we had here was to stop viewing things in such binaries, because perhaps material is just material. And if you look at some of the objects that we've got from site, a lot of them are actually recycled cement, cement bags that are plastic. And they're found like this. They're found while on walks. Somebody will find a cement bag, start to tear it open, make it into thread, and then continue to weave like this. So, and that's not to say that, there shouldn't be spaces that we keep devoid of plastic, but more to say that maybe those binaries aren't the binaries of material, but rather the binaries we imagine.
Also to say that, to just re-emphasize what Rhea was saying, that like there's always been this human nature kind of separation, right? And also this now with, conversation also becoming more about the impact of humans in nature, there's also this sort of project incentivization of how humans can also be the saviors of nature versus this sort of co-evolution and co-holding that human and nature do. What's also very, very much a pastoral ethic is responsiveness, adaptiveness, being in new and changing circumstances, being in uncertain worlds, and being very much able to be in the present and tack back and forth between like multiple ways of being and multiple realms of thinking and, really navigating through complexity is a very strong pastoral ethic, which in fact even explains or, somehow makes us think, the death of pastoralists, for example, that pastoralists will settle down and, will, evolve into different livelihoods and things like that is something that people have been saying, I don't know, if like couple of 100 years now or more. And still today, you see, and our photos here, our work here testifies that this is actually a very thriving livelihood. And there are reasons why this continues to be present and practiced because of this kind of adaptiveness.
So that also brings me to this idea of deep sensing that you've been suggesting to us from yesterday. You made us cook in the dark, and so in a way, you speak about sensing. It's not deep knowing, but deep sensing as a kind of epistemic shift. But I'm also wondering if different bodies sense differently. Do different genders sense differently? Do different castes sense differently? So how do you kind of bring this phenomenological understanding to bear with the idea of difference?
I'm very big on embodying. I'm very big on being present and being there. And part of me seems to think or believe or has even experienced in a way that actually immersing oneself in context impinges on the body, on the senses, on the ways of being, right? So even, for example, the pastoralist, if I go to an eye doctor today, the eye doctor seems to think that I have no problems with my eyesight, seems to say that, hey, my eyesight is perfect. And yet when I'm on camp with the pastoralists and they are pointing out to things in the horizon I cannot see, they will be, look, there's a woman, she's going with, a pot of water. I'm like, where? There's a camel. Where's the camel? And then they'll be like, oh, you're used to just seeing this distance. When you're out in camp in a very sort of flat landscape, you see as far as the horizon when you're vigilant about where your animals are and things like that. And all of these things begin to, shift and change the ways in which we perceive and sense and our bodies are. But having said that, I think both Rhea and I have been very, very aware of where we come from as well and what our bodies represent. What our bodies represent as women, what our bodies represent as urban, upper caste, upper class women, and what access that allows us. And it's very obvious and open to us. We know very clearly that all of this research was only possible because of that positionality. We work with that awareness.
Yeah, even on camp, the first question you get asked is, kya nacho, and the second question be kai jati, So caste is such a big part of it, and I think it was almost, we were welcome in that space because we are both daughters of Vanyas. That's how we would be described, Vanyani Dikri, or like daughters of the trader caste, right? So that gives us caste privilege to be in these spaces and be welcome in these spaces and thought of as acceptable in these spaces also. But also, back to that question of sensing and knowing, Rupali, it's such a good one because also it's something that I've always wondered, like, is there a difference? To sense is to know and vice versa, right? And I think about how, we use our cameras to to click further than we can see. And we use all of these devices to sense in different ways what we can't, sort of extend our senses through multiple devices. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting was in this landscape and in these relationships, there was such an extension of senses through the knowledge and intimate knowledge of other beings. So, by just seeing the expression on a camel's face, Rama Bhai could tell us, oh, they've seen the mangroves, and that's why he's excited, And so there was so much of that kind of gauging what's around by extending through the senses of the camels or of the sheep, that I think that perhaps the question that we like to focus on in like a little bit of a romantic way is more what languages we shared and what can be shared and developed together rather than the differences in the ways that we sense and see, and allows for those differences to then add to our capacity to imagine the world as well.
I guess it was also about like, were the women sensing differently, were the men sensing differently, were like, younger people sensing differently.
Yeah, no, that too. Definitely, I think we were definitely sensing differently. But, there were these interesting insights like G.V. Bain once told us that if you are, if you keep sheep, then you're always scanning around because you have to make sure that there is nothing coming to harm the sheep, right? But if you're keeping camels, you're walking in mangroves, you're always looking at the ground. So you're not falling or tripping on like in mud. And so again, perhaps those communities also end up, like what community you're in also ends up being a very different kind of sensing. In terms of gender, of course, there's, all tasks on camp are gendered. But we also, fortunately, spent a lot of time with G.V. Bain and Jagabhai, and they don't live in a traditional camp because it's just the two of them. So often they exchange tasks in the sense that not that Jagabhai ever cooks apart from tea, but G.V. Bain goes out with the camels and, takes care of that sometimes when he can't. And so we managed to see those, roles interchange and realize that it's, we might have had a slightly different experience in that sense. And in terms of the younger ones, it's been really fun to watch because they really bring these two worlds together, right? They're always on their phones, on Instagram, or like on Facebook, like a lot of young people. But they're also fascinated with the camels and with their lives. So they have accounts where they're constantly filming the camels, and will go find baby camels to shoot to get more likes. There is a thriving Rabari culture online, from music to, I don't know, dancing videos of ceremonies, all sorts of things, including a lot of political thought in the space. And everyone from every gender we met was truly connected through their phones to what's happening in their villages, what's happening with the communities not around them, but that are Rabari too. And so it was really, really fun.
So something we also tried doing to reflect these differences, right? Like, for example, we took back some photographs that we had clicked in field and actually just asked people to imagine and make knowledge and things like that. And you have the same question asked to different people of the family, and they had different interpretations of what their homes should look like, what their lives should look like. Some of their preoccupations, for example, were different and things like that. So there are ways in which we use this sort of visual material and things like that for our research as well.
I'm going to open this up to the audience, but just one question, and maybe you can also answer the audience question.